Hey everyone, welcome to the Eternal Card or Eternal Patch Breakdown. My name is Pojo. We are not streaming today. Some last minute changes move my schedule around, so we will be streaming on Wednesday instead at 7 p.m. PST, and of course Tuesday and Thursday and Friday, and basically every other day that we can manage. But yeah, so there have been a bunch of new nerfs, as you can see, primarily in Throne mode, as well as some new buffs. We're going to be talking about all of those, so let's go ahead and go through the patch notes. There's a bunch of different things going on here, and we're going to talk over each of them in turn. So most of these changes are to Throne mode. They are primarily aimed at making Throne mode a little bit more interesting and entertaining, which I fully support. The Throne mode is currently pretty wild right now. I would say it's not a terribly fun experience, and I'm not even sure that like with this amount of buffs, this is going to be enough to make the format playable again. Like it is really, really interesting. We're in a very unique position here where we have essentially a vintage to legacy format with a really huge pool of cards, which normally does not have like a strong balance. It's pretty hard to do any sort of strong balancing when you have this many cards. Things get pretty crazy. The meta gets really, really insane. But we are actually live balancing those cards, and that's something that is like, I think that's relatively new territory. It's not something that like Magic has ever really done. Like you can ban out cards in Vintage and Legacy when they start to get really oppressive, but for the most part, those formats are where cards just exist, and like they will exist until they are so broken that you absolutely have to get rid of them, and the meta is always just sort of whatever the meta is. There's like a couple of different decks you can run. But yeah, like this time around, we are actually making some efforts to make Throne mode playable. So I'm curious to see exactly how well it works out. This seems like a good first pass. And I also think it's a pretty interesting thing to be making. I think it's a good thing, rather, to be making Throne changes right now as opposed to Expedition changes, since currently Expedition is feeling pretty good, and also we have the upcoming tournament. I don't think anyone wants to see like any major changes to Expedition too close to the tournament, so that's something that like we're pretty excited about. So let's talk about the changes. First things first, we have Champion of Fury. This is probably the biggest one. Well, no, they're all pretty big. Champion of Fury, however, has gone from a 2/2 to a 2/1. Same different abilities. +1 in charge, +1 in overwhelm, so a 4/1 if it comes down with double hybrid power, but now is a 2/1 instead of a 2/2. This essentially means that it's going to be trading with just about everything. It won't die to a lot of incidental. It will now die to a bunch of incidental effects that deal 1 damage, like, for example, Tamaris Earthshaker. It'll die to Grenadin drones. It'll die to Temper and, like, any sort of card that does, like, small amounts of damage, like Greed's Reward. It'll die to Vara's Favor, which I think is one of the biggest ones. Like, there's a lot of different things that Champion now goes down to. It's still a really, really aggressive play that kind of benefits a lot from having, like, Yeti bonuses to health. The Yeti bonuses to health in particular are just really, really strong here. But like I would say that overall it's definitely not as strong as a card as it used to be. It is still a 4 damage burn spell that can be repeated if your opponent does not have good answers or is playing too slowly, and that's a real thing. So I don't think the card is completely kaput, but it also means that it is just not as strong a card as it primarily used to be. Alongside this, we have a nerf to Snowcrust Yeti. So let's go ahead and talk about that as well, because these two probably go together in a pair. Snowcrust Yeti has gone from a 2/1 to a 1/1. So it's gone from being a Snowcrust Yeti to being a Steadfast Deputy. The one notable thing about this, I would say, is that like as far as Yeti go, like a Yeti 1/1 is better than a Soldier 1/1 by quite a large margin. So if you wanted to play this card with a weapon deck or with a bunch of Yeti buffs like Wump Party Starter and that kind of thing, you might still be able to do it. Still, an entire 1 extra attack on a 1-drop is a really big deal, and I would say that this card is relatively unplayable in most formats, if not all formats at this point. You could potentially buff it up, but unlike Champion of Fury, this card's probably not coming back. The nice thing about this nerf, I think, is that it opens up the possibility for other 1-drop Yetis to take its place. There are actually a lot of really good 1-drop Yetis, or at least there are a couple of good ones. We have Yeti Spy, we have Belligerent Yeti. Oh, Belligerent Yeti is actually a 2. We have Snow Rager, and we have Powder Glider and Farplace Finder as well. Farplace Finder not so much on the playable side, but Powder Glider certainly in the like interesting area of like potential opportunities. You also have Yeti Bully as well, so there's a couple of interesting choices there that might potentially replace it. Mischief Yeti was the one that I was thinking of, not the other one. So So you can now like run Mischief Yeti in that spot, Powder Glider in that spot, or possibly even Snow Rager, a card that I actually love, and I think people really kind of undersold early on in Yetis. I think this card's actually quite good, and could potentially be a good replacement if you're looking for something along those lines. The main problems here is that if you're still playing Yeti-based decks, you definitely have to deal with a lot more like of getting swept by Hailstorm, of getting swept by Lightning Storm, of getting swept by basically anything that completely sweeps the board. Like, unless you're playing like Vadius Clanfather, then you're not going to get as much Aegis in your deck, which means that you're going to be running into a lot easier to throw boards, which makes Skycrag aggro a lot less viable, I would say. I think that Champion of Fury has always been pretty crazy overpowered. I think that Snowcrest Yeti has always kind of dominated the one-drop slot in Primal, and I'm pretty happy to see both of these cards nerfed in general, but it is true that, like, as far as Yetis go, we're going to have to see some really interesting changes to make Yetis viable and thrown again, and that's going to be very, very different. The objective here, according to the patch notes, is to make it more make it so that players have incentives to try out different Yeti cards and play with different play patterns. I think that's really important. I think that Yetis in general are very fun cards. One of the ways that their design kind of tends to trend is that instead of being like just aggro cards, they often have like a lot of interesting things that they're doing. They're creating cards, they're making snowballs, they're doing a lot of other like weird stuff, and they kind of play in really weird, interesting synergies with each other. They're really well-designed cards in general, but Snowcrest Yeti and Champion of Fury were always sort of the least interesting of the batch. They had Aegis, they had Charge, and like that, those two skills, while pretty powerful and pretty spiky, are not traditionally very good. So now if you want to play a Yeti deck, you kind of have to go into some more interesting places. You have to try out some different play patterns. You have to do some pretty crazy stuff, and that's very, very cool. I think that's definitely along the lines of something that might actually be pretty strong. So could be really interesting. I really like these changes. I think it's a pretty solid option, and overall makes for a lot of stuff to be going on. Okay, Garden of Omens. Let's see here. So your spells cost 1 less. Now is 5 and double fire, double primal, with your spells cost 1 less, but also has a durability of 2, going down from 3. So dies to Char, dies to Heart of the Vault, dies to a lot of different effects that actually deal like small amounts of damage, can also be like pinged down with snowballs a little easier, that kind of thing, and overwhelm damage. Just basically makes this card a lot less vulnerable. This card was insanely strong, so I'm happy to see either the durability go down or the Skycrag setup, where like you have the extra influence on both sides and you have to go very deep into Skycrag to run it. I think that the Skycrag setup was definitely a good idea like from the start. I'm not sure about this decreased durability. That's an awful lot to ask of a site that, even if it does kill a thing when it comes out, and also has that attachment destruction, which is crazy, and resurface, which is a very powerful card, like all of the things that Garden of Omens have going on are probably still worth the site in general, but this was a pretty significant nerf, and it hit it on a number of different levels. Not only is like Skycrag alone like sort of one of the weaker places to put Garden of Omens, not that Caldera and Cradle decks weren't delightful, but also like that durability hit is like a really big hit to power on what is now a much more inflexible card. I think that this might have been like a little bit overkill, but it certainly will take Garden of Omens out of the meta for a while, which I think, considering the amount of unitless control decks and like very spell heavy decks that we've seen, is probably a pretty welcome sight in Throne and should make the meta a lot more bearable. It's also important to hit cards like this very hard when you're hitting aggro cards so very hard. Like we have seen basically like one of the chief aggro decks getting nerfed here. There's actually going to be a couple more nerfs to control decks as well, so it's certainly going to change the meta up a little bit. Like we're not just hitting one particular section of play that's difficult, we're hitting multiples. So let's talk about those other changes as well. Vanquish, the staple of set 1, has gone from 2 cost to 3, kill a unit with 4 strength or more. The only thing I don't like about this change, I do think that Vanquish is pretty ubiquitous and has always been sort of a thing that punishes decks for playing big cards, just like for being Injustice. If you want to talk about like Justice as like a pile of strong cards, Vanquish was definitely kind of a big issue there, because not only do they have some pretty strong cards, but they were able to very easily kill your strong cards to make it so that their stuff just survived a lot longer. Like Sandstorm Titan into Vanquish kind of made their whole flying strategies like very easy to deal with. I think this is a pretty reasonable nerf, particularly because people are running a lot of Vanquishes and a lot of Defiances in these formats. They're pretty ubiquitous. Basically, the objective on this one is to make sure that people don't run 4 of each of them, and that Justice decks are just running both like a big pile of Vanquishes and a big pile of Defiances. So both of them have been like tuned a little bit to make it a little bit more difficult to run these, and a little bit more you have to actually be looking at a particular type of meta to run this type of thing. I think this change means that big Praxis and other types of decks have a lot more potential capability to survive in a ranked environment or in a throne environment. So yeah, that's going to be pretty interesting. I think that overall it should be really good for any decks that want to run like a big time or anything along those lines. And it's also a very hard hit to Justice decks, which I think is pretty necessary if you want to make Justice like actually have some apparent weaknesses. And this is definitely a good place to start. Defiance is the other thing that has been nerfed. Defiance's nerf is also quite disgusting. Kill an attacking enemy unit with cost 2 or less as opposed to 3, or stun an attacking enemy unit with cost 3 or more as opposed to 4. So basically just takes down the potential ability of Defiance to get a tempo advantage from 3 to 2 while giving it the ability to stun other things. The main thing that really loves all of these changes, I think, is Stone Scar aggro. If you're looking at like Champion of Chaos, that is like a very, very big card right now that got rebuffed in the face of Defiance because Defiance was just around to control it. I'm actually kind of surprised that they didn't take Champion down immediately upon taking Defiance down, because that was like the one thing that kind of keeps that card in check. I wouldn't be surprised to see Stone Scar aggro really seeing a resurgence amongst not only Champion of Fury going down in value, but also like cards like Defiance going away. It's pretty interesting. Certainly Desecrate is still around. There's still plenty of ways to sort of deal with big cards like this, but like Throne Mode always has like lots and lots of options. But this is a pretty interesting nerf to a lot of valuable and powerful things that might be attacking in. Also, like, there's a lot of cards that exist at 3 that are just fascinating and just couldn't exist in Throne Mode previously. Ramba Arena Showman was like a really wildly fun card. Takos Waystone Harvester has always been really, really cool. Like, there's a ton of things that happen at 3 where it's just like, oh man, I love these cards, but you attack into a Defiance, the Defiance goes out, like, and they don't really even have to spend that much tempo on it, you lose the unit, and then suddenly you're behind for the rest of the game. I think this is a really good change. I'm very surprised that this card existed in its own format for as long as it has. Not so surprised by Vanquish existing for as long as it has. Like, that is a card that allows you to control decks that are just way too big. But nowadays, there's plenty of decks that are just way too big, and there's lots of ways to control those decks. Defiance, on the other hand, allowed you to just play control and never ever get punished for it. So I think this is a really, really important nerf that actually might make Throne a lot more bearable. So that should be really interesting. All right, so there are also some buffs. Statuary Maiden. Everybody said that the nerf to it was like a little bit too harsh, and it appears they were right. Statuary Maiden is now a 2/3 from a 2/2. This makes it a much more viable market card. If you want to say that there's no difference between 2 and 3 health, I think you are fundamentally wrong. This gives it the ability to trade with just a lot more different types of units. It means that you take damage from a lot less of certain types of spells, but primarily on like the unit trading and on the general durability. Like, Statuary Maiden just lives through a lot more this way. It's still not on the same level as it was before, which was pretty much ubiquitous among Stone Scar decks, but I think it's a solid market card here now and does some interesting things that allow you to play a little bit more with attachments. So yeah, that might be something that people actually play around with. It also prevents Entomb and Revenge, so yeah, like, there's certainly some reasons to grab this hate card now. That nerf was definitely a little bit too high, and I'm happy to see it back to 3. I don't ever want to see it at 4 again, but I think that that's a perfectly fine rollback. Mirus Nightshade, still a +1/+1 while enemy is cursed, but the ultimate now costs 4. I like encouraging this card. I think that 5 was always too expensive for Nyctophobia. Like, you just never really saw that card. If people were playing it, they were probably just completely out of things to do and didn't really have anything good to be happening. And that was a big issue because, like, overall, if you're paying 5 to play Nyctophobia because you don't have anything else left to do, the main problem with that is that you're then giving your opponent Nightfall. And even though they take like a little extra damage from certain Nightfall cards sometimes, and Mirus is getting a little bit of a bonus from it, like, they get to draw an extra card before you do, and that's a big drawback. That ultimate was always too expensive. Paying 4 is a lot better, and like it also enables a bunch of curse strategies and a bunch of unseen curse strategies, which it seems like they're trying to make a push for in Throne. Pretty fond of this card. I don't believe it's in Expeditions. I'm pretty sure that it is not, but like overall, this seems like a really strong sort of buff to that setup and should be pretty interesting. Shadow Unseen could be fairly interesting in general, and I think that that's a strong choice. The other option is Barros Intervention. So now, giving an enemy -2 health instead of -1 health, and one of your units gets unblockable or drawn unseen from your void. So the main change here is that now kills units with 2 health as opposed to just 1 health. Not only that, but it's still a permanent effect, so you get to prevent recursion on those effects. Like, this is like a char with an upside on slow speed that also has like a modal option where you can get unseen back or you can give things unblockable. I would say that's enough that even if you're only using it for 2 of those modes, it's still a pretty strong card. This is cheap removal that kills small things pretty quickly and also allows you to basically like run across with certain types of synergies. Like if you're running a bunch of unseen, or if you're running any like really big unseen that might actually do some wild things in your deck, this is something that can really help you out. And then like the unblockability is good for any type of like Haunting Scream deck, which is a lot more viable with Defiance being nerfed. It's also good with any type of deck that wants to use infiltrates, or any type of deck that has like a bunch of lifesteal units that wants to get across. If you want to do like paladins or anything along those lines, yeah, this card's really interesting now. I like this card a lot. I've always liked Barros Intervention, but it definitely never has had the ability to functionally, like the idea behind it was that the modal part of it meant that none of the different modes were really capable of wreaking good enough board or card advantage to justify its existence. Like, it's a worse Dark Return, it's a mostly bad unblockable trick, and like it kind of sometimes kills one unit, but that unit probably isn't very good, so you don't really get a lot out of it. Now it actually kills aggressive 2-drops, and you still get all of the benefits of those other modes if you decide not to use it, or like your opponent's playing big stuff. I think that that's a really big change up. This card should actually see some play in Throne mode. And if it ever goes back into Expeditions, it should be a very strong removal piece in those types of setups as well. Yeah, I like this buff as well. Like, I'm pretty fond of all of the buffs and nerfs here overall. The one thing that I'm a little concerned about, the only thing that I think I'm somewhat worried about here, is that Vanquish and Defiance, the 2 cards that both got like the very big hits that are, I think, pretty meta-defining. Vanquish and Defiance are both commons. And that's one place that I think is a little, or well, they're not both commons, they're both uncommons. Is Defiance a rare? No, Defiance is an uncommon as well. So these are really cheap and really good cards for like early players to sort of use to get an advantage over their opponents. They allow you to deal with cards like Sandstorm Titan with Vanquish, and they allow you to deal with cards like Champion of Fury with Defiance, or Champion of Chaos, or any number of like really aggressive rares and legendaries, as well as any number of big slow rares and legendaries. So these cards getting weaker in general is a little worrying, I think, if you're trying to play Throne on a budget. On the other hand, Expedition is kind of supposed to be the budget format, I think. I mean, the limited power level, the fact that you have a lot of other things going on, that's definitely pretty important. But I do think that if there were one thing that I would say as a criticism of this patch, it's not the balance changes on the cards, but rather that they didn't provide any new cheap options for new players coming into Throne. I think that like maybe giving a legendary like a nerf to a common, or a nerf to a rare or something like that, or like reducing the cost of some other effective strategy so that like there's a couple more lines for new players to follow as opposed to just nerfing like very good cards on that front. That might have been something that could have been a little bit better done here. And that's the only thing that I would have considered like as extra for this. So that's a lot of changes to Throne mode in general. I'm still not convinced that Throne mode is necessarily going to be an extremely fun format, but I'm interested at least in the attempt to live balance it, and I hope that this patch is followed by other patches. We'll see how this plays. Certainly we're hitting a lot of what I would call like really meta-defining cards and potentially shaking things up a lot in Throne mode. So it's going to be the Wild West out there for a little bit longer, and I think that's going to be really interesting. Maybe actually actually generate some really cool Throne games. We'll see if it solidifies into something fun. I hope that that's the case, but I imagine more nerfs or buffs might be required to make Throne mode like truly accessible in this type of format, because it's just very, very difficult to get a good format going when you have that many cards in the format. Still, rotational format is here. Like, hopefully we're seeing leagues at the end of the month, which is going to be great. We have the tournaments now in rotation as well. And Throne mode, I appreciate the efforts to maintain it. I'm very well hoping that this is going to be like a new and fun mode in general. I think it's going to be pretty exciting to see what ends up happening. I'm very curious to see how Throne mode plays out with all of these new changes. That's going to be really exciting. And yeah, I'm pretty psyched to be playing some more. But not tonight, because we are off for the night. So we'll be back on Tuesday, 7 p.m. PST. Feel free to watch us on Twitch. We might do like a very late night stream tonight if we get a chance, because we want to play with the new cards, but it'll probably be like 11 p.m. PST if we manage it. So we'll see. In any case, thank you so much for watching. I will see you all tomorrow, and we have more videos ready to go. So you should be seeing some basically every day for this week, if at all possible. And that's it. Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Bye. Ooh.